Not every story in the Bible is easy to read. Some challenge us, shake us, and force us to confront the darker sides of humanity. These narratives reveal the consequences when a society loses its moral foundation and turns away from God. They're not just accounts of the past, they hold lessons that echo through time, lessons we desperately need today. Before we delve into this profound narrative, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insightful explorations of biblical stories. Your support enables us to continue bringing these important lessons to light. What transpires when a nation forsakes its moral compass? How does one heinous act ignite a chain reaction leading to civil war and near annihilation? Stay with us as we unravel this chilling episode from the Book of Judges. The era of the Judges was a time of great instability for the people of Israel. It was a period marked by cycles of sin, suffering, repentance, and deliverance. Without a centralized leadership or a king to guide them, the tribes of Israel often found themselves drifting away from the covenant they had made with God. This recurring phrase encapsulates the essence of the time. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. It was not only a statement of their political disarray, but a stark reflection of their moral condition. The lack of accountability meant that societal and spiritual decay went unchecked. Lawlessness spread, justice became uneven, and the worship of foreign gods infiltrated their culture. Communities became isolated, each tribe acting in its own interests rather than uniting under the shared purpose of serving Yahweh. This fragmentation set the stage for many of the tragic events recorded in the Book of Judges. In this backdrop, the Levite story emerges as a sobering reminder of what happens when a nation loses its moral compass. The tragedy of Gibeah was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of neglecting God's laws and allowing sin to take root in their society. The stage was set for chaos, and this story would show the devastating consequences of living without the guidance of a righteous God. Against this chaotic backdrop, we are introduced to a Levite, a man set apart for religious service. Levites were tasked with maintaining the worship and rituals of the Lord, serving as mediators between God and his people. However, in this story, the Levite is not depicted fulfilling his sacred duties. Instead, his actions reveal a deeply flawed character, reflecting the moral degradation of the time. This Levite lived in the remote hill country of Ephraim, far from the bustling cities or the central places of worship. He had taken a concubine, a secondary wife, from Bethlehem in Judah. The arrangement of having a concubine was not unusual in that cultural context, though it often signified a lower status for the woman involved. However, their relationship was strained. For reasons left unclear, the concubine became angry with him and left, returning to her father's house in Bethlehem. The Levite, after a time, decided to reconcile with her. His journey to Bethlehem demonstrates both his desire to restore the relationship and the complexities of their union. Upon arriving at her father's home, he was greeted warmly. The concubine's father extended hospitality to the Levite, urging him to stay for several days. This act of hospitality, while culturally appropriate, began to delay the Levite's departure. Each day, the father-in-law encouraged the Levite to linger, offering food and drink, showing no urgency to send his daughter back. This extended hospitality, though kind on the surface, became an obstacle to the Levite's plans. After 5 days of delays, the Levite finally decided it was time to leave, even though the day was already drawing to a close. With his concubine and servant, he began the journey back to Ephraim, a decision that would prove consequential. As the Levite, his concubine, and his servant traveled, the sun began to set. The fading daylight presented a challenge. Where would they find shelter for the night? In the ancient world, the safety of travelers depended heavily on the hospitality of others. It was customary for communities to offer lodging to strangers, especially within the covenant nation of Israel. The Levite servant suggested they stop in Jebus, a nearby city inhabited by Jebusites, a Canaanite people. However, the Levite refused. "We will not turn aside into a city of foreigners who are not Israelites. We will go on to Gibeah." His reasoning was clear. He trusted that a town of fellow Israelites, part of the tribe of Benjamin, would provide the hospitality and safety they needed. The group pressed on and arrived in Gibeah as night fell. But contrary to their expectations, no one in the town offered them lodging. This lack of hospitality was a glaring violation of the cultural norms of the time. In Israel, hospitality was not just a social courtesy, it was a sacred duty. To refuse aid to a traveler was a mark of moral failure. The group waited in the town square, a common practice for travelers seeking accommodation. As the hours passed and no offers came, their vulnerability increased. Finally, an elderly man, himself a sojourner from the hill country of Ephraim, spotted them and approached. This man, recognizing their plight, extended an invitation to stay in his home, saying, "You are welcome to my house. Let me supply whatever you need. Only do not spend the night in the square." The old man's words hinted at the dangers that lurked in Gibeah after dark. What should have been a safe haven among fellow Israelites was instead a place fraught with moral corruption and danger. The Levite, his concubine, and his servant gratefully accepted the offer and went to the man's home, where he provided them with food and a place to rest. But the shadows of night concealed more than just the absence of hospitality. Gibeah's lack of kindness was a symptom of a deeper issue, a community that had strayed far from God's commands. The stage was now set for one of the most disturbing and tragic events in Israel's history. As the Levite, his concubine, and servant entered Gibeah, the town seemed quiet, its streets empty. They settled in the town square, expecting someone to extend an invitation for lodging, a common practice in Israel. Yet, as the evening wore on, no one came forward. This was not just an inconvenience, it was a glaring violation of cultural norms. In ancient Israel, hospitality was seen as a sacred duty, especially within the covenant community. The refusal to provide shelter to travelers revealed the moral decay that had taken root in Gibeah. The Levite must have felt a growing sense of unease as the sun set and shadows stretched across the square. Being left out in the open at night, particularly in a town belonging to the tribe of Benjamin, would have been an unexpected and troubling experience. It was a stark contrast to the generous hospitality he had received at his concubine's father's house in Bethlehem. Finally, an elderly man approached. He, too, was not a native of Gibeah but a sojourner from the hill country of Ephraim, the same region as the Levite. Perhaps recognizing a shared origin or simply out of compassion, the old man extended an offer of hospitality. He greeted them with warmth and invited them into his home, saying, "You are welcome at my house. Let me supply whatever you need. But do not stay the night in the square." The old man's insistence carried an ominous undertone. It was clear that he knew something about Gibeah that the travelers did not. His offer was a stark reminder of how far the town had strayed from the principles of righteousness and kindness. Despite the moral failures of the community, this elderly man acted as a beacon of decency, showing that even in the darkest places, there can still be individuals who uphold the values of compassion and responsibility. Grateful for the refuge, the Levite, his concubine, and his servant followed the old man to his house. He provided for their needs, offering food and drink, and ensuring they were comfortable. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the dangers of the night might pass without incident. But as the travelers settled in, the true nature of Gibeah would soon reveal itself in a way that no one could have anticipated. As the night deepened, the tranquility of the old man's home was shattered by the sound of voices outside. A group of men from the city had gathered around the house. Their intentions were unmistakably wicked. They called out to the old man, demanding that he send out the Levite so they could assault him. This was an act of unspeakable depravity and a horrifying testament to the moral corruption that had taken hold of Gibeah. The old man stepped outside to confront the mob. His words revealed both his horror at their demands and his desperation to protect his guests. "No, my friends," he pleaded. "Don't be so wicked. Since this man is my guest, don't do this outrageous thing." In ancient Middle Eastern culture, hospitality was not merely a gesture of kindness, it was a sacred obligation. A host was expected to protect their guest, even at great personal cost. Yet, What the old man did next reflected the distorted moral compass of the time. In an attempt to appease the mob, the old man offered his virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine instead. This proposal, though intended to protect the Levite, was a horrifying compromise, revealing just how deeply the values of justice and righteousness had been eroded. It was a tragic display of misplaced priorities, where the preservation of cultural norms took precedence over the dignity and safety of innocent individuals. Despite the old man's desperate plea, the mob refused to back down. The situation grew more dire by the moment, and the Levite, faced with the escalating danger, made a decision that would haunt the pages of history. He seized his concubine and pushed her out the door to the waiting crowd. It was an act of betrayal and cowardice, sacrificing her to save himself. The old man's house fell silent as the door was shut, leaving the concubine to face the horrors outside. What followed was a night of unimaginable cruelty. The men of Gibeah took the concubine and subjected her to brutal abuse. Her cries, muffled by the darkness, must have echoed through the silent streets, a haunting reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink when moral restraints are abandoned. As the first light of dawn broke over Gibeah, the concubine, battered and broken, made her way back to the house where her master was staying. She collapsed at the threshold, her hands outstretched toward the door, as if seeking refuge that had been denied her. Inside, the Levite remained, seemingly indifferent to the horrors that had unfolded outside. When he opened the door and saw her lifeless form, his reaction was shockingly cold. "Get up, let's go," he said, but there was no response. She was dead. The sight of the concubine's body at the doorstep was a tragic and chilling symbol of the moral failure not just of Gibeah, but of the Levite himself. Her death was not only the result of the mob's actions, but also of the Levite's willingness to sacrifice her for his own safety. It was a moment that reflected the broader moral decay of Israel, a nation that had turned away from God's laws and allowed injustice to flourish. The events of that night in Gibeah would set in motion a chain of consequences that would reverberate throughout Israel. The concubine's suffering and death were not just personal tragedies, they were a reflection of a society that had lost its way, a people in desperate need of repentance and restoration. This horrific act would serve as a catalyst for one of the most devastating conflicts in Israel's history, a stark reminder of the consequences of forsaking righteousness. When the Levite discovered his concubine's lifeless body at the doorstep, the weight of the night's events settled on him. The violence, the betrayal, the sheer magnitude of the atrocity, this was no longer just a story. It was a tragedy that reflected the moral collapse of an entire nation. But the Levite's response was as shocking as the events that had transpired. Seeking to awaken the conscience of Israel, he took her body and divided it into 12 parts. Each part was sent to one of the 12 tribes of Israel, accompanied by a message that demanded they confront the wickedness that had occurred in Gibeah. This act was unprecedented and horrifying. The sight of the dismembered parts arriving in each region caused shockwaves throughout the nation. People gathered in disbelief and outrage, asking, "Has anything like this ever happened before?" The Levite's method, though gruesome, achieved its intended purpose. It was a wake-up call to a nation that had grown desensitized to injustice. By forcing them to witness the consequences of unchecked sin, he compelled them to take action. But the Levite's actions also raised questions about his own character. Why had he not protected his concubine? Why did he choose such a shocking way to spread his message? His silence on his own role in the events left a moral ambiguity that complicated the story. While his message demanded justice, it also highlighted the deeper issue of personal accountability. The lesson here is clear. While it is important to call out injustice, we must also examine our own actions and take responsibility where we have failed. The tribes of Israel were united in their horror. Leaders and warriors gathered at Mizpah, 100,000 strong, to hear the Levite recount the events of that night. His account was detailed and emotional, though notably absent was any mention of his decision to sacrifice his concubine to the mob. He described the men of Gibeah as wicked beyond measure and painted the tragedy as an assault on the entire nation of Israel. His words stoked the anger of the tribes, igniting a unified determination to seek justice. The leaders agreed that such a crime could not go unpunished. They sent envoys to the tribe of Benjamin, demanding that the men of Gibeah responsible for the atrocity be handed over to face justice. This was not a call for indiscriminate revenge, but a measured demand for accountability. However, the response from Benjamin was one of defiance. Instead of surrendering the guilty men, the Benjamites chose to protect them, prioritizing tribal loyalty over righteousness. This refusal revealed a deep-seated issue within the nation. The tribal system, meant to unify Israel under God's covenant, had devolved into fragmented loyalties that often overshadowed justice. Benjamin's decision to shield the perpetrators instead of condemning their actions exposed a dangerous prioritization of pride and identity over morality and communal responsibility. This teaches us a critical lesson. When loyalty to a group, tribe, or ideology becomes more important than standing for what is right, it can lead to catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. The defiance of Benjamin escalated the situation into an outright civil war. The tribes of Israel, unified in their demand for justice, gathered their forces and prepared for battle. They first sought guidance from God, asking, "Who shall go up first to fight against Benjamin?" The Lord responded, "Judah shall go first." Encouraged by this divine direction, the Israelites launched their first assault. But the battles that followed were far from straightforward. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Benjamites fought with remarkable skill and ferocity. On the first day of battle, 22,000 Israelite soldiers were killed. The second day saw another 18,000 fall. These staggering losses forced the Israelites to confront their own vulnerability and question their commitment to justice. They returned to Bethel, fasting, weeping, and seeking God's guidance once more. This time, the Lord assured them, "Go, for tomorrow I will give them into your hands." On the third day, the Israelites implemented a new strategy. They set an ambush around the city of Gibeah, drawing Benjamin's forces out into the open. As the Benjamites pursued what they thought was a retreating Israelite army, the ambush was sprung. The tide of the battle turned decisively. By the end of the day, 25,000 Benjamite warriors lay dead, and the city of Gibeah was destroyed. The aftermath of the war was devastating. Only 600 men from the tribe of Benjamin survived, fleeing to the wilderness and taking refuge at the rock of Rimmon. The Israelites, consumed by their pursuit of justice, had nearly obliterated an entire tribe. It was a sobering moment that forced the nation to reckon with the cost of their actions. They had sought to punish wickedness, but had come dangerously close to erasing one of the 12 tribes of Israel. This story is a powerful reminder of the consequences of unchecked sin and the importance of justice. The actions of Gibeah's men were a reflection of the moral decay that had taken hold of Israel. But the refusal of Benjamin to hold them accountable highlighted an equally dangerous issue: the failure to address wrongdoing within our own communities. Justice requires courage, even when it means confronting those closest to us. At the same time, the Civil War demonstrates the destructive power of internal strife. The tribes of Israel were meant to be a united people under God, yet their inability to resolve conflict peacefully led to catastrophic violence. This teaches us the value of seeking resolution through righteousness and humility rather than pride and defiance. This story challenges us to reflect on the role of personal accountability. The Levite's actions, though intended to provoke justice, were deeply flawed. His failure to protect his concubine and his choice to use her death as a political statement revealed the dangers of prioritizing personal grievances over moral responsibility. True leadership requires integrity and the willingness to confront our own failures as well as those of others. The aftermath of the Civil War left Israel in a state of both victory and mourning. While the wickedness in Gibeah had been addressed and justice seemingly served, the near destruction of the tribe of Benjamin brought a sobering realization to the other tribes. Out of the 12 tribes of Israel, Benjamin was now on the brink of extinction. Only 600 Benjamite men had survived the war, hiding in the wilderness at the rock of Rimmon. Their cities were burned, their families were gone, and their future as a tribe hung by a thread. The remaining tribes gathered to reflect on what had happened. In their anger and pursuit of justice, they had vowed not to give their daughters in marriage to Benjamin. Now, this oath presented a grave dilemma. Without wives, the surviving men of Benjamin had no way to rebuild their tribe. The extinction of Benjamin would not only be a tragic loss for Israel, but also a direct violation of the covenant God had made with all 12 tribes. Faced with this crisis, the tribes devised a controversial solution. They identified a group that had not participated in the assembly at Mizpah, an isolated community in Jabesh-Gilead. The decision was made to send an army to Jabesh-Gilead to secure wives for the Benjamites from among the young women of that town. While this act was fraught with ethical complexities, it reflected the desperation of a nation seeking to preserve its unity and fulfill its covenant obligations. Still, the number of women obtained from Jabesh-Gilead was not enough. The elders of Israel convened once more, determined to find another way to ensure the survival of Benjamin. They instructed the remaining Benjamite men to go to Shiloh during a festival and take wives from among the young women who came out to dance. This plan, though deeply controversial, was carried out with the intent of balancing justice with mercy. The Benjamites followed the instructions, and the tribe began the slow process of rebuilding. The actions taken during this period highlight the complexities of justice and mercy. While the punishment of Gibeah was necessary, the near eradication of Benjamin was a sobering reminder of the consequences of excessive vengeance. The efforts to preserve the tribe, though morally challenging, reflected Israel's commitment to maintaining the integrity of the 12 tribes as God had ordained. This teaches us an important lesson. Even in the pursuit of justice, we must be mindful of mercy and the greater good of the community. As the dust settled from the war and Benjamin began to rebuild, the tribes of Israel turned their attention to the broader lessons of the tragedy. The events of Gibeah and the subsequent civil war had exposed the deep moral and spiritual failures within the nation. Israel's leaders recognized that the root cause of these events was not merely the actions of a few wicked men, but the systemic neglect of God's commandments across the entire nation. The period following the war became one of reflection and renewal. The tribes sought to reaffirm their commitment to the covenant they had made with God at Mount Sinai. They recognized that the law of God was not merely a set of rules but a foundation for justice, compassion, and communal responsibility. Without adherence to these principles, the nation would continue to spiral into chaos. In this time of reflection, the leaders of Israel emphasized the importance of returning to the worship of the one true God. The idols and foreign practices that had crept into their culture were identified as distractions that had led them away from righteousness. Sacrifices were made, prayers were offered, and the people sought God's guidance for how to move forward as a united nation. The story of Gibeah and the Civil War became a cautionary tale for future generations. It served as a reminder of the consequences of neglecting justice and allowing sin to take root within the community. The leaders stressed the importance of addressing wrongdoing immediately and fairly, rather than letting it fester and grow into something that could divide the nation. At the heart of this period of renewal was a renewed emphasis on communal responsibility. The tribes acknowledged that the failure in Gibeah was not just the fault of the Benjamites, but a reflection of the broader moral decay within Israel. They committed to holding one another accountable and supporting one another in upholding the values of justice and compassion. This reaffirmation of covenant values marked a turning point, a moment where Israel sought to rebuild not just Benjamin, but the moral fabric of the entire nation. This process of restoration and reflection offers a powerful lesson for us today. It reminds us that even in the face of tragedy and failure, there is an opportunity for renewal. By turning back to God, seeking His guidance, and committing to live according to His principles, we can rebuild what has been broken and move forward with hope and purpose. The story of the Levite and his concubine is one of the most harrowing narratives in the Bible. It begins with a simple journey, a Levite traveling to reconcile with his concubine, and descends into unimaginable tragedy. From the brutal events in Gibeah to the shocking response of the Levite in dismembering his concubine and sending her body parts across Israel, this narrative exposes the depths of moral corruption in a society that had turned away from God's laws. The resulting outrage united the tribes of Israel, but the pursuit of justice, came at a tremendous cost. The refusal of Benjamin to hold its own people accountable escalated into a civil war that nearly wiped out an entire tribe. The devastating toll of this conflict forced the nation to grapple with the consequences of their actions, leading to a fragile restoration and a renewed commitment to God's covenant. This story is not just about the tragedy of one woman or one tribe. It is a stark portrayal of what happens when a society forsakes moral and divine guidance. The phrase, "everyone did as they saw fit," echoes throughout the story, illustrating the dangers of living without a unifying moral authority. When individuals or communities decide what is right based solely on their own preferences, chaos and injustice inevitably follow. This narrative serves as a reminder that morality cannot be subjective if a society is to function justly. Addressing wrongdoing is essential to prevent societal decay. The initial crime in Gibeah was horrific, but the failure of the tribe of Benjamin to hold the perpetrators accountable escalated the situation into a national crisis. This teaches us that justice must be pursued courageously and impartially, even when it is uncomfortable or requires confronting those closest to us. Apathy and inaction in the face of evil implicate the entire community. The events in Gibeah were not just the failure of a few wicked men, they were a reflection of a society that had grown desensitized to sin. This story challenges us to recognize our collective responsibility to address injustice and uphold righteousness. At its core, this narrative underscores the importance of adhering to God's laws. When Israel strayed from God's guidance, the result was moral decay, division, and suffering. Only by returning to His principles could they begin the process of restoration and healing. This is a timeless lesson for any community seeking to build a just and compassionate society. As we reflect on this sobering narrative, it is important to ask ourselves, what can we learn from the mistakes of the past? Are there injustices being overlooked in our own communities? Are there moments when we prioritize loyalty to our group or comfort over standing for what is right? Let this story inspire us to take action. Examine your own life and surroundings. How can you contribute to upholding righteousness and justice? How can you ensure that the values of compassion, accountability, and unity are reflected in your community? We encourage you to share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. Engage in the discussion, share this video with others to spread awareness, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth biblical analyses. Together, we can learn from these ancient narratives and apply their lessons to build a more just and compassionate society. Thank you for watching, and may we all strive to walk in righteousness and truth. This outline presents the disturbing account of the Levite and his concubine, interspersed with reflections on the moral and societal implications of each event. It aims to engage the audience thoughtfully, encouraging them to derive lessons applicable to contemporary life.